Yes. So, well, I think the title's clear enough, and I hope that some of you at least have heard of or come across Joseph Cardijn, founder of the Young Christian Workers movement, and also an inspiration for many other movements of the 20th century, both in the Catholic world and also, as maybe we'll learn today, in the non-Catholic world as well. So that's why I titled it A Tool for Synodal, Ecumenical and Interfaith Dialogue and Collaboration. Yeah, look, one of the inspirations for this talk comes from the Plenary Council. We were very pleased to see that there was a kind of, not sure if it's a direct or indirect reference to the Sea Judge Act in the Decree number 6 on formation and leadership, which speaks of being attentive to the signs of the times and reflecting on people's concrete experience in the light of the gospel and engaging as missionary disciples. We're really happy to see that. On the other hand, kind of perhaps it sort of slightly waters down the Sea Judge Act, so and maybe drenches it in a little bit too much holy water. So what I wanted to do today was to try and get back to the origins of the Sea Judge Act and see what it meant for those that developed it over a period of really 100 years, and based on that we can see how we would want to implement it today. So I've got my talk divided into 5 parts. Where Cardijn got his ideas from, how he developed them with the JOC, the YCW, how the Church adopted the Sea Judge Act method, and then fourthly, how that can and is being used in a synodal way and also as a tool in not only ecumenical interfaith dialogue, but also for actual collaboration. So I'll begin with the first part of Cardijn's sources. And I've listed 4 people there, and a movement, the Sion movement, the French movement, which was perhaps the first, I believe it was the first to really implement what today we call the Sea Judge Act. But I'll start with, oh, yes, I did want to show you this for those of you who may know Paris, who may have studied there or at least visited there. Are you familiar with the Luxembourg Gardens or the Saint-Sulpice Church right in the centre of Paris there near the Catholic Institute? Amazingly enough, if you look at those little red names I've posted there, most of this first part of what I'm talking about today all happened within about 1 kilometre of the Senates or of the Garden of Luxembourg over a period of about 50 years in the second half of the 19th century. Actually, apart from anything else, it's a great example of a networking effect where people's shared ideas and passed them on from one generation to the other and had a very great impact. But the first person I wanted to talk about was a guy called Frédéric Laplay, a pioneer sociologist who began his life as a mining engineer and was shocked at the poverty that he witnessed across Europe in that first half of the 19th century. And he sought to apply what he'd learned in his studies at the Polytechnic School and the School of Mines, the scientific method. He sought to apply that method to the solution of what he saw as those social problems. And he developed a 3-part method, so which you'll recognise immediately, I think, beginning with the facts, then moving towards the principles, and thirdly, the solutions that are necessary. And the method that he developed, he called it the social observation method. You can see there the scientific link and basis of what he was doing. What's interesting in this context is the way he looked at principles. He also applied the empirical method to deducing, working out the principles that should apply in society. And from a kind of distant point of view, a century later, people are somewhat critical because he went all across Europe to identify the principles that ought to be at the basis of a good society. And lo and behold, he discovered that the 10 Commandments was a pretty good summary, which of course makes sense in 19th century Europe, where many people were at least baptized in it also became a point of criticism of his work later, that he was a sociological approach and he didn't refer directly to, from the Catholic point of view, to Catholic doctrine. A second critique of what he did was that he was too paternalistic, because it's true, the critique is true that he was very much a counter-revolutionary spirit, wanted to see a restoration of medieval society. And if you look at the method of shown there, the cover of one of his books, La méthode sociale destinée aux classes dirigeantes. So he's addressing his book to the ruling class, explicitly to the ruling classes, because he saw that they should have taken a role like the medieval lords, who had a supposed to be a mutual relationship with the people that lived on their estates. And that's basically the sort of thing he was trying to restore, but of course became a very of his work. Also related to the sociological critique was that you cannot just apply a sort of a deterministic scientific approach to human society. Need for a moral dimension. And this is where we move to the second, not the second generation, because actually it was one of his colleagues, Alphonse Gratry, a French priest and philosopher and theologian, a colleague of his at the Polytechnic School, who first initially wrote his doctoral thesis on the scientific method, or his first doctoral thesis. Later became principal of Stanislas College, a boys' college in Paris, where he recruited Frederick Ozanam as one of his teachers, and later at the École Normale Supérieure and chaplain to the Senate, which gave him a very great influence over the leading leaders of French society of the time. And he did seek to develop that moral dimension, to add the moral dimension to the Le Play approach. He was one of the first, I won't say he was the first, but he was certainly one of the first, at least from a Catholic point of view, to speak of the need to read the signs of the times, as we've come to do, especially since Vatican II. So apart from anything else, I'd like to pay tribute to Alphonse Gratry as a great pioneer of what we've come to recognise in the Church today. And he developed a three-part method, which you can see the moral basis there, beginning with what we perceive with the senses. We look at reality, we use our intellect, reflection, and then we arrive at a decision. We do something, we use our will, we resolve to change things, to do something. So in summary, you could call Gratry's method reality, reflection, and resolution. I don't think he ever used the three words in that sense, but that if you look at it, you can see very clearly and explicitly that that's the way he expressed it. And as his disciple Léon Ollé-Laprune put it, Gratry signalled the hideous wounds of society in living detail, naming things by their names, and from that he provoked reflection and examination of conscience, leading to resolutions that led to change. So this was the way Léon Ollé-Laprune interpreted Gratry. He was a disciple. Ollé-Laprune was very well known in the second half of the 19th century in France. He became known as the second Ozanam. And he also was a disciple of Le Play. In fact, if you look at that map I showed you earlier, they lived in the same building on the square, the Saint-Sulpice square there. So clearly, up and down the stairs, day by day, they must have had a great deal of informal as well as formal contact. One of his kind of theses, university theses, was on Aristotle's, or ethics, what we call the Aristotelian ethics in English, which is basically Aristotle's explanation of virtue ethics. And in one of the chapters there, he develops the virtue of prudence, explaining how Aristotle kind of worked out that political leaders need the virtue of prudence, and they go through the three stages of looking at what's happening in society, reflecting on it from the point of view of principles, and making decisions as political leaders. Now, Ollé-Laprune, this was the end of the 19th century, saw that France was becoming a democracy. From that point of view, he saw that all citizens need to learn to have that prudence of the political leader in Aristotle's time. And this is what he said in 1894. Every person must apply themselves better than ever to consulting courageously and faithfully the principles and facts in order to make themselves better than ever capable of seeing clearly, judging and deciding. So there you can see In 1894, he's saying it directly. In fact, he said it a year earlier in another context, talking to some students at Stanislas College, which I've mentioned earlier in the context of Gratry. You will look directly at the things that divide men, and peace will come through light and frankness with your judgment, and together you will look for a solution. So you can see there, France was a very divided society at the end of the 19th century, particularly between Catholics and anti-clericals. So he saw, you can see this very clearly, he saw initially the Sea Judge Act as a tool for building social peace, social unity, for overcoming that direction, that contention within the division, by helping people to see together, to judge together, and finally to arrive at decisions together. Now, as I said, he spoke about this in 1893 to a group of students led by a young 20-year-old student called Marc Sanier, who was directly inspired by, in fact, they knew each other, or the families knew each other, because, as I said, they lived within a few hundred meters of each other. And Marc Sanier launched a study circle in the basement of that Stanislas College, seeking directly to implement Ollé-Laprune's ideas. And you can see there, this is a few years later, he explains what they were trying to do. Every citizen must know the state of the country. When the situation is bad, he must seek solutions, and having found the solutions, he must act. Again, it's not exactly the Sea Judge Act in words, but you can see the commonality of approach there. That's why I call the Sion movement, which grew from that study circle, it means in English the furrow. It was in fact the prototype of the JOC, the YCW, and the later specialised Catholic action movements, who later gave a name to that method, which we now know as the Sea Judge Act. But for them, they articulated that as a method of democratic education, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago in relation to the way Ollé-Laprune had promoted it, a method in particular of promoting democratic virtue. So through seeing, judging and acting day by day, week by week, people develop a habit. People develop a habit of seeing, of judging and acting, virtue in an Aristotelian sense. Now, here's the dangerous thing that students did, those students they were by then, by around 1907. They began cooperating with the Protestants, Protestant youth movements, I think the French equivalent of the YMCA, other similar things. There are many other things that happened as well. There was a movement called the Action Française, very kind of anti-revolutionary movement. The short story is they ended up in a lot of problems with the hierarchy, who accused them of escaping hierarchical control, which led Pope Pius X to write to the French movement, bishops calling on the leaders of the Sion to resign from their posts, which they did. Amazingly enough, it was apart from anything else, it caused a great shock that they resigned. And in effect, in one sense, they were preserving their heritage by not compromising. I think in a way, that's the way I interpret it. But they'd already had a huge impact. I should mention also one of their chaplains, who also took this whole process more in a Thomistic dimension, or at least gave a Thomistic backing, philosophy and theology to this whole thing. Some of you may be familiar with Sertilange. He was a Dominican, founded the Review Thomist. He was a chaplain to the movement, became a professor of moral theology, and he moved to Belgium because all the French religious congregation, or many of them, were booted out of France in 1903 by the anti-clerical government. There he wrote this book called La Philosophie Morale of St. Thomas Aquinas, in which he further developed. It's very well worth reading, especially the chapter on prudence, because you can see there very clearly articulated the prudential philosophy that lays behind the See, Judge and Act. He called it himself Seek, Judge and Act, chercher. But of course, we can see that it's a very similar thing. So this is the context in which Cardijn grew up, read Gratry and Ollé-Laprune while he was in the seminary, learnt of the Sion. He'd even visited them in France, in northern France, in Lille. He was very familiar with it. It was a time of social change in the Industrial Revolution in Belgium. There's even quite important to say, I will also say, people say he went to the famous Catholic Congress in Malines in 1909, where Lambert Baudouin was a speaker, and people often credit that as the start of the liturgical movement, perhaps also the ecumenical movement at a certain level. Cardijn later became very close and worked very closely with the Benedictines in France. So all these things was the environment in which Cardijn sought to, was learning, I suppose. 1912, Larkin, Notre Dame, Our Lady of Larkin, where finally that he'd learned. And here it's very significant to see two of the first people he worked with, he identified clearly that he wanted to, was a young trade unionist and feminist, Victoire Cap, and a young guy called Cardijn, who later became, he's still recognised as a co-founder of the Young Christian Workers. They had both already learned the Sion methods, what I'm talking about, the method of democratic education. So it's very clear it was a mutual meeting of minds and methods, and they began to work with young women workers quite significantly in the Larkin area. And it's interesting to see Cardijn, this is his first published article on this kind of work. He speaks of how a leader must begin from experience, the facts of life that cry out and mourn suffering, misery and injustice. And a good study circle transforms, recreates and converts an environment through collective action and personal influence. So you can see the emphasis already from 1914 on personal formation and individual development, even though in that article there, he hadn't yet got to the point of articulating what we later will see as the Gigacz Act, which began to be articulated after World War I around 1922, when you see this was a meeting. Cardijn always worked collectively. This was a meeting again with Victoire Cap and another priest called René Hordenard, who was actually the scribe of the meeting and who wrote the report. And they kind of summarized the process that they were developing. First rule, social initiation based on investigation. Second rule, judging those facts in the light of principles. And thirdly, moving from an idea, from that ideas to action. So there we see more clearly articulated than perhaps the Sion had done, what they were trying to do in the social formation that they were promoting through those study circles. And again, I note here, this article was published in a magazine called La Femme Belge, the Belgian woman. So all this was happening, developed out of the women's study circles, actually. And I really believe a very neglected figure in all this is Victoire Cap, who ought to get much greater credit from history for her influence. By 1925, 26, the term Gigacz Act had emerged. But it's significant in that period from 1920, the JOC manuals were published. The first edition is 1925 for the boys, 1925-26 for the girls. And it's in the manual of the JOC F, the girls' YCW, that we first see the Gigacz Act method and developed and articulated, the study circle and its methods. However, it was the second edition in 1930, both male and female versions and Belgian and French versions, which became the classical explanation of the Gigacz Act, which became influential literally across the world, taken up in many countries. Before that, amazing kind of what got around the world, really, including to Australia. That's another story in itself, but it had a huge impact, articulating the Gigacz Act in a way that was able to be taken up by people around the world, not only leading to the beginnings of the Young Christian Workers in other countries, but also its related movements such as the Young Christian movements and other inverted commas specialized movements for farmers. And later on, there were adult, significantly student and adult university students and adults later on. Now, all this caused, Cardijn faced a lot of criticism, just as the Laplay model had been criticised, too sociological. Cardijn also was criticised for playing down, you could say, the doctrinal aspect. Published in 1926 by a very, very Jesuit, Valère Hornet, and in which it's deliberately a response to the manuals of the JOC. In chapter 3, it's headed Doctrine d'abord. In other words, not starting with the facts, but starting with the church's teaching, what we've come to call the deductive method, as opposed to what from Vatican II became known as the inductive method. And what was Cardijn's response to that? Over a period of which became known as the three truths, which we really haven't got time to develop into that now, but it's a very important point. He drew on the French philosopher Proudhon, who developed the real ideal dialectic, and Cardijn basically adapted to the Gigacz Act, articulating what he called the truth of faith, the eternal and temporal destiny of each young worker and of all young workers. In other words, that's the Christian message, and the contradiction between that Christian message and the state in which young workers were living. Now, the significant thing about Proudhon was, as opposed to, say, the Marxist dialectic, which called for an immediate once and for all revolution, Proudhon saw that wouldn't solve the problems. There are always going to be problems. Therefore, you need a method. And this is what Cardijn articulates as the Gigacz Act. So his response was to say, yes, we have got a truth of faith. This is the Christian teaching on which we base ourselves. That is the ideal, but we're also dealing with the real, the truth of experience that people live day to day. And we try to resolve that contradiction through the Gigacz Act. And again, this became the classical formulation, and we'll see also right up to Vatican II, and including in Gaudium and Spes. It's the structure that was actually adopted in Gaudium and Spes. But we also see here how, Cardijn from the beginning,
excuse me,
of course, in Belgium.
Stefan, okay. I'm sorry. I'm just going to mute everyone, and then Stefan, I'll bring you in again. Just getting a little bit of background. And Stefan, could you please explain what JOC initials stand for?
Oh, sorry. Yep, I'll do that. Tell me when to start again.
Okay, well, I've muted everyone. And now I'm going to, you can unmute.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're still muted, Stefan. You'll have to unmute it on your screen.
Okay, sorry. Now I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I should have been more clear. JOC stands for Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, which is in English translated as Young Christian Workers, so YCW for us in Australia. But what I wanted to say was, in Belgium, of course, it's at that time especially, was almost a totally Catholic country, even though there were many people that had kind of left the church. So there was no concept of reaching out, let's say, to Protestants or to people of other faiths. But as soon as the YCW, I'll call it now, as soon as it moved out of Europe, especially, this issue arose of what to do with people who are not of a Christian faith. And we see here a French redemptorist working in Vietnam raised this question to Cardijn in 1935. What do I do here in a country where with only 1 in 20 people are Catholics? How can we use YCW methods in a pagan? That's a very strong word to use, but anyway, that was how it was in those days. How do we use the YCW? What can we do for those young pagans? How can we bring them under our wings? And Cardijn was very clear in his response. He didn't want a separate movement for the pagans or the non-Christians. He said the YCW is for all young workers. Now, we didn't answer the question of how do you actually do that, but he said very clearly here, the aim is to improve the religious, moral and physical life of young workers. In other words, the aim was not to convert those young people to Catholicism, proselytism. It was to improve their own life, beginning with their life. So this is the approach Cardijn took right from the start, and you can see how this can apply also very much in a non-Catholic or non-Christian. And this, a few years later, it's interesting to see how the Anglicans in the UK, at least in one diocese, Winchester, they heard of Cardijn's work, as many people had, and sought to study to see how they could use it themselves in the UK in the Anglican context. And they sent this pastor or priest, GWO Adolf, to Belgium to study it, and he wrote a book on it. Unfortunately, we don't know really what happened. It looks like nothing much came out of it in terms of action, but it's very interesting to see that Cardijn was very open to working with the Anglicans already in 1938. So he's very open in 1934 to make the YC open to non-Christians, and also in Europe to working with other Christian denominations. And you see how Adelshaw articulates the problem, very close terms to the way Cardijn saw it. Worship has become divorced from the ordinary life of the world. There appears to be no relation between what's done at the altar and the grim realities of everyday working life. So we can see there that Adelshaw really grasped pretty clearly and well what Cardijn was on about, even if he wasn't able to implement it at that time. Now, as Cardijn came, the Second War, and Cardijn began to travel internationally, I should say, intercontinentally after the war. And it's very interesting to see his reflections on some of his early trips. And he wrote this article with this, it wasn't the title of the article, but look at that phrase there, bankruptcy of evangelization, Latin America and Africa at that time, and saw, what the colonists had done in the Europeans. He named them himself, what the Europeans and the colonists had done as the occupying power in those countries, their scandalous profits and the exploitation, in contrast with the shameful misery of the indigenous masses. So, this was a big shock to him. And in the meantime, he turns this into a critique of what he saw, the way that evangelization was being carried out. Nothing was being done, or certainly not enough was being done. The inadequacy of efforts in the fields of education, housing, all the basic human services that were necessary. So clearly his conclusion was another method was necessary. And of course, you don't have to guess very far. He didn't articulate in the article, but it's clear that he thought that the YCW method was the response. The Gigacz Act was the response that he proposed to that bankruptcy of evangelization methods. And by 1961, he's articulated that even further especially in relation to non-Christians, speaking of how the essential character of the YCW is to teach young workers among themselves and by themselves, to understand their value and mission, whether they are Catholics, Buddhists, Hindus, or Muslims. So he was going around the world at this time in many countries where, in fact, for example, in Asia, I know the story of the YCW in Asia. In many countries, it began in Catholic parishes, which are, of course, the minority. For example, to take one example, Thailand, the YCW began in Catholic parishes, which were mainly among the middle-class Chinese ethnic community. They weren't reaching the young workers in the factories, who are all Buddhists, almost by definition. So here he is articulating the need for the YCW to reach out to all young workers without distinction of religion. And that's really the way in which he actually came into controversy late in his life because of the radicalness of his position. We can see also it's in this time how it didn't all happen in many stages. Actually, the French bishops had already been adopting the Gigacz Act themselves from the 1940s, but by 1961 we see Mater and Magistra John the 23rd explicitly adopts the Gigacz Act in paragraph 236, and in fact that was a decisive stage, I would say, because Vatican II was beginning the next year. And it meant that when Vatican II opened in 1962, been recognised already as an official kind of Catholic social method, you could say. So then we see, I'm jumping ahead of this, just the outline. We see how I'll go a bit quicker. Yeah, so we see the articulation of that in Mater and Magistra, and the need for everything to be translated into action. So over the next 3 years of Vatican II, we see how that was put into practice in the Vatican II documents. In particular, we see in November 1964, it was a formal decision of the commission that was responsible for the drafting of what became Gaudium and Spes. They explicitly adopted the Gigacz Act as a drafting method as far as possible, start from the facts, develop a Christian judgment, and offer concrete pastoral action orientations. And it's not an accident that the drafter of the final version of Gaudium and Spes was a French priest called Pierre Holtmann, who had been not only a YCW chaplain, but also a chaplain to the middle-class specialised Catholic action movement, and also the adult Catholic Christian workers movement, Action Catholique Ouvrière. He was steeped in the Cardijn method, Pierre Holtmann, so it's very clear it was a choice made to place him there as the drafter of the final document. And we can see what happened. We can see how actually the structure of Gaudium and Spes clearly follows Cardijn's Proudhonian dialectic. The introductory statement is the truth of experience, the truth of reality. Part 1, Church and Man's Calling, explains what Cardijn called the truth of faith, or Proudhon called the ideal. And then part 2 is the method. So in fact, if you look at the 5 chapters of Gaudium and Spes, you'll see each one is an individual C-Judge Act. Each one was drafted by a different subcommittee, and you'll see some did it better than others, and you can see the difference between them. I think the one on culture is actually the most explicit and perhaps the best done from a C-Judge Act point of view. But you can see how Hauptmann, of course, he wasn't acting alone. He was acting on the instructions of the drafting commission. They adopted the C-Judge Act, they implemented the C-Judge Act, and not only the C-Judge Act, but also what Cardijn called the 3 truths, the Proudhonian dialectic as a structure. Now, here's an interesting point. Why isn't the facts part 1 of Gaudium and Spes, you might ask? Why is it the introduction? Shouldn't it all be parts 1, 2, and 3? Well, there's a very big and important reason for that. It's because that old argument was still there. You know, we cannot start. This is a church. This is a council, ecumenical council of the church. We can't start with the facts. We have to start with doctrine. So the compromise reached was, well, we'll put the facts in the introduction, and then we'll put the doctrine in part 1. So this is, you know, the hermeneutic of Gaudium and Spes from a C-Judge Act point of view as to why it's not in part 1, but introductory statement. Because, for example, I put down the bottom, Soonens, you know, for all his reputation, he was an opponent of the C-Judge Act and was very unhappy with that method that was chosen for the drafting of that final document. And also we see the formation aspect is taken up again in Apostolicam Actuositatem. The need prudently, again, the reference there to prudence. They were clear at that time, the prudential philosophical basis of the whole thing, and they saw that as a basis for formation of lay people. Now, it's very interesting the way this was taken up after Vatican II by the Latin American bishops. Many of the Latin American bishops, who of course most of them had been at Vatican II, in a sense they were free. You know, they had to make so many compromises at Vatican II. Suddenly all these bishops were free. They draft 16 documents, every one of them is a C-Judge Act. And it's, you know, actually it's at Medellin in 1968 that they first developed the phrase new evangelization. And they don't say it explicitly, but if you read it, you can see that what they meant by the method for the new evangelization is actually largely, but not only, of course, also intensive catechesis, but largely based on using the C-Judge Act method and model. And of course, that's exactly what's happened in Latin America since 1968. Aparecida in 2007. Of course, the future Pope Francis was there, played a huge role in the drafting of that document, which reaffirmed the C-Judge Act as the method. So we see how that had a huge impact, particularly in Latin America, and is now gradually making an impact in North America, in the USA. The C-Judge Act is coming back through the Latinos, and of course around the world through the influence of Pope Francis. But of course, we see also in the years since the Council, you know, Pope Paul VI adopted it as a framework in Octogesima Adveniens. Even John Paul II does. He speaks of Think Judge Act in Laborum Exercens. It's there in the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine. And of course, Francis again in Laudato Si. So it's become an integral part of the whole Catholic social teaching and practice. And more recently, we see how it's become more clearly articulated. Particularly, we see a few people have started to articulate it in the context of synodality, again, which has also largely come out of the Latin American experience. It's interesting to see the new Cardinal, Robert McElroy, explicitly explaining how the importance of the C-Judge Act methodology in developing a synodal process, because it's not an individualistic thing. As we saw right from the start here, it's a collective, it has its personal dimension, but it also has a collective dimension whereby we do things together. So it's a way of looking at the reality of the world, working out what's wrong and needs to be changed and what needs to be done collectively. And this is, I think, how McElroy sees the use of the C-Judge Act as part of the synodal process. Interestingly, he comes from San Diego, which was a hotbed of there used to be a Cardijn centre there for many years, and he's very much in line with the whole spirit of the San Diego diocese for a long time. It's interesting to see in the ecumenical context. It was not only brought in there by Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire, of course, was a Catholic. He learnt the Sea Judge Act from the YCW and the Catholic Action Movement. He recognised it himself many times. And it's also interesting. Sometimes people get it wrong. They say Freire's Sea Judge Act method. Well, it's true in a way. He made it his own method, but it's very clear he was a major promoter of the Sea Judge Act method through his writings and teaching of his method, and then he later worked for the World Council of Churches. I actually met him there. It was kind of a nice experience. I was there with some people from the YCW, and he came out of his office very pleased to meet the people from the YCW. As I say, he was very clear in his recognition of his indebtedness to the whole Cardijn method. But anyway, I put that there, showing how it's got now an importance in the ecumenical interfaith Christian world. In Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, there's a centre called the Ujama Centre, which was a collaboration between Catholics and Christians of other denominations, who have also adopted the Sea Judge Act method as their method of work, working closely with the South African others, adopting the Sea Judge Act to the South African context, particularly in the context, and also the Latin American liberation ideas, particularly in the context of working for social change in South Africa. Now, I don't really have a lot to kind of tell you specifically about how it's used in the interfaith context, except I can tell you it has been used a lot in the YCW in Asia, the Sea Judge Act with people of other faiths. I mentioned Thailand, how it began as a Catholic little movement among the Catholic communities by the 1980s. It existed totally among the young workers of Thailand, who are almost, I would say literally to a person, were all Buddhists, but they were able to use the Sea Judge Act in their own work and developing some very great actions there. And another movement called the Young People for Development, which I helped start also in Southeast Asia, we worked to sort of bring in elements of the different traditions, and not just referring to the Christian gospel, but also to Islamic and Buddhist and other texts. So it shows you again how the method can be adapted to every kind of context. And I just wanted to finish here, how Cardijn also saw this as a very important tool, you could say, for developing religious freedom. He didn't believe very much in the idea of juridical religious freedom, whereby the state guaranteed. He saw that as a very defensive approach. He didn't believe in that. He wanted religious freedom for people so that they could learn to see and to judge and to act together. And this is his speech at Vatican II, by which time he'd become a cardinal. And this is what he was trying to emphasize to the bishops of the world: the need for religious freedom based on education, which he also summarized again in the words, see, judge, and act. And that was the most critical thing for him. So, what's the conclusion out of all that? Well, I return again back to the starting point of the decrees from the plenary council, and it's good what it says as a means for formation. It's a clear recognition of the Sea Judge Act as a means of formation, and the need to be grounded in scriptural reflection, and also the reception of ecclesial wisdom and prayerful discernment. And how this needs to shape Christian engagement with the community through listening and dialogue, and supporting actions for transformation of society through daily commitment and public witness. So actually, it's kind of not bad. It's not quite as strong as perhaps I'd like to put it, but the guts of it is there. And if we know where the Sea Judge Act comes from, we can interpret that. We've got a hermeneutic for, let's say, for implementing what the plenary council has adopted. So how do we do that? Well, I'll just finish on this point. Well, actually, I belong to the Australian Cardijn Institute, and we're actually developing a program for this under the title Leadership for Transformation and Social Change. We're partnering with Catholic Theological Institute, Catholic College, and we could be interested also with YTU and others as well, if you're interested in such a thing. But basically the idea is to teach these methods that I've been speaking about to not only to young people, but particularly to leaders of the church, not just priests, but religious, seminarians, lay ministers, youth ministers, teachers, all those, particularly working with young people in the church, so that we can provide them with the tools for, hopefully, transformation and social change. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Stefan. And if we all unmute ourselves, I'm sure others like myself have got questions or comments you'd like to ask. Lots of questions, not questions so much, but comments were raised while hearing you. Just show, for interest, how many of you were involved in YCW or YCS? Just either raise a hand or put your hand up. Yeah, a few of us. Okay. So, any questions or comments? Robin.
Just a very, thank you so much, Stefan. Just right on that last slide, can you explain the logo for the leadership and for transformation and social change? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. You know, do you know a program called Canva? Anyway, no. It's a great program. I use it every day now. It helps you to make graphics. So I found one. I don't really have an explanation for it, but I'm going to use that little graphic as the meaning I'm giving to it is transformation and social change. So that's what it means.
Okay, thank you.
It means, as Alice in Wonderland says, it means what you want it to mean. That's what it now means.
Okay, thank you.
Stefan, I was very involved in YCS, right? That was 64 to 66. And even at that time in Melbourne, there was resistance. There was people saying, as you did, a lack of doctrine in the YCS. Some of the principles you stated are also principles that were very much involved in the earlier religious education models that were being used. And again, they came under great criticism and were completely reversed to a top-down. Start with the doctrine, then and then. Anyway, that's what I've seen happen in Melbourne.
Yeah. Well, yes, actually, Catherine Massam. I don't know if you know Catherine Massam.
I know Catherine, yes.
Yes. On how the C.J. Jack was brought into the religious education sphere after Vatican II. And then, as you say, there was a reversal. And I don't know, were you involved in the plenary council? But like, I suspect there was resistance to the C.J. Jack in the plenary council. Let's say a certain archbishop, I know he's expressed publicly his reservations about the C.J. Jack. And I kind of feel like I'm not saying it directly, but if you read what the plenary council decree says, you know, the emphasis is we've got the Catholic tradition and all that kind of thing. It's as if the C.J. Jack is kind of too weak in itself. You know, we've got to add something. We've got to super add make sure nobody misses out on the doctrine part. And I think that there was some of that in the plenary, but I wasn't there. But it's what I kind of suspect. Yeah. But yeah, it's always going to be there, I suppose. But yeah.
Rosie?
Thanks, Stefan, for your presentation. Having been involved in YCS and YCW, it brought back many memories. But what I found you highlighted for me was that the C-Judge Act and working from experience as the basis, it set the background for the Second Vatican Council, where there was a change from working from doctrine top down to a person's experience. And I thought that was quite enlightening.
Yeah. Well, look, it's very interesting. Actually, in my PhD thesis, I should put the link. I put it on the web. I've made an e-version. I've published it as a book on the web. It's free, but it's very clear. For example, one of the things I documented for my thesis was that out of the, by the end, it was probably 3,000 bishops involved, but at any one time there was 2,500. At least 250 who had direct experience in the YCS and the other similar movements. So actually that means 1 out of 10, or nearly 1 out of 10. And they also had a very strong network before the council. So actually they had a very greatly disproportionate influence on the outcome of the council. As I mentioned in relation to Gaudium and Spes, basically they left Sunans as the figurehead for Gaudium and Spes, but they completely revolutionised the drafting of it. That's what happened. That's why Sunans was upset with it at the end, and he said it later. Well, they went in another direction. He didn't like the way it had gone. Yeah.
John.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting presentation indeed. It's a very practical presentation as well, so I'm just going to raise a couple of theoretical questions. I'll raise one at this point, and it has to do with the way in which, and I've heard it today, language of up and down, from above to below and from below to above, no matter what that is, whether it's experience or interpretation or seeing or something like that, works, and that expresses a fundamental misunderstanding of what the act of interpretation is, and therefore what doctrine is, for instance. And sometimes it's a misinterpretation that comes off the back of people who do doctrine but misunderstand what it's about. So it misunderstands doctrine and it misunderstands action. So I wonder if interpreted in a certain kind of way, so I say a certain kind of way, the see, judge, and act, when read as an interpretive strategy, is rather simplistic in its hermeneutics, given that there are significant, as numerous hermeneutical theorists point out, there are all kinds of interesting and sophisticated ways in which seeing is never something, or experiencing is never something that comes uninterpreted. It's always interpreted. Secondly, in which doctrine is never something that is imposed. It can't just descend from above. It's always something that takes into consideration the ways in which things actually work, and has a mirror of that reality placed upon it. So I just wondered if there's some of that misunderstanding that sometimes runs through the discourse, and what, as a result of that, I was going to ask if you would agree with that, and if as a result of that, what the see, judge, and act would look like if interpreted in a more sophisticated hermeneutical way.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And, I'll tell you one experience I had in 1981. I was working for the Australian YCW, and we had to go to Sydney. We were trying to start the YCW in the eastern region of Sydney. And I remember I met these youth ministers, and I proudly showed them a See, Judge, Act inquiry on migrants that actually I'd written and that we were using with local groups. And they looked at it, the youth worker, the youth minister, well, actually one of them in particular, and she looked at it and said, "This is childish." She said, "This is for kids." I was kind of totally shocked. I couldn't believe it, because that wasn't my experience in working with the people when we worked with, young people, obviously 18, 20 years old. As a starting point, it is very simple, but it's a starting point. So obviously things develop out of it. But anyway, it did challenge me, I knew from my own experience of using the See, Judge, Act with like local groups and things, I knew that there was something very solid behind it because it worked. So I wanted to kind of find out the basis of it, and strangely enough, I was in Chicago once, and I met another youth minister, and he proudly told me it was based on St. Thomas Aquinas. And I was shocked again, because I'd never heard this before, even though I'd worked so many years for the YCW. So that's how I kind of began to research, let's say, not the basis of it, the theoretical basis of the See, Judge, Act. But I think the whole virtue ethics thing is very important in this, because it's not just a matter of see, judge, and act, turning it into a formula. It's the fact of doing it. And this is, I would say, it's very important, the formative aspect of it. This week, for example, I can tell you there's many stories that could be told. You know, one of the first actions I had to do as a young worker in the YCW was talk to the young Indigenous guy that nobody talked to at work. And I had to figure out how am I going to make friends with this guy, you know, say good day to him the first day. Almost so insignificant. He didn't respond to me the first day. I said again to him the second day, how you going? No response. After a week, finally I got something from him, and within 3 months he was my best mate in that place where we were working. So it's sort of like repetition. Like everything, there's nothing magic about the See Judge Act. It's like everybody can run, but how do you become an Olympic runner? By learning how to the way to move your arms, to lift your thighs up, all those different things. And I think that's what the See Judge Act teaches people to do. It teaches people to do better what they're already doing, and it makes it a habit. People learn to act. I've been in many other kind of Christian groups in parishes and all that sort of thing, and some of them even, you know, they'll use the gospel as a reflection. And then I feel frustrated at the end, because where's the action? There's no concept in the group of somebody, what are we going to do this week? There's just no action, and we come back. And you know, I don't want to criticize. I think Alpha is a fantastic thing. You know, I've been to Alpha, you know, and I'll promote it. But a little bit, it's the same thing. We study the Bible, and there's no outcome in terms of a personal response. Well, there may be. You know, we learn how. Well, could we invite another person to Alpha or something like that? You know, so it's got that sort of level of response, but it doesn't show people how to do something about the person that's bugging them at work or something like that. So it kind of, it's very simple, but I wouldn't say it's simplistic. But also that's why I, kind of wanted to present, the theoretical foundations of the See Judge Act. And of course, you can take many aspects of it to a greater level. The big thing has been, especially in the 70s onwards, was structural analysis. The See part was done a structural analysis of society because, well, we got a problem with our boss, but what about the bigger issue of the multinational corporation that's behind it and things like that? So everything can be developed at another angle. But, I was very impressed, I must say. I met, I don't know if you know him, Gerald Weston, is it, from the Ujamaa Centre in South Africa. And I mean, it's quite impressive, their experience in how they use the gospel, much, being Protestant, much more than Catholics. They really unpack the gospel reading and apply it to the situation and the oppression of Black communities and all that sort of thing. So I think, it's a simple framework, but it can be done in a very sophisticated way. Anyway, that's my answer. Hope it goes some way.
Thank you, Stefan. Stefan, I look back to the many young people who went through the JCS Young Christian Students movement, and many of them moved into some form of Christian ministry. So it was a formative experience for later commitments. So also I think God was a Josephist, because he says in Exodus 3:7, I have seen, I have heard, I mean to come and act. See Judge Act.
Yeah, well, it's, even Aristotle probably wasn't the first to sort of, but I mean, it's true. He did kind of try to articulate systematically how do political leaders come to make a decision. That was what he was trying to articulate. And he saw, well, they got to know what's happening in the Greek society or Athens society. And secondly, they got to kind of apply some principles to it. And thirdly, they got to make a decision, because it's like the George Bush thing. I'm the decider, that's what politicians are. Yeah. But at the same time, if you're going to have a democracy, you've got to move to the citizenship level, therefore, not just deciding what others are going to do, but what I'm going to do and what we are going to do. Yeah.
Chris. Yeah. And Rosie, and that will have to be the end.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, Stephen. I can understand why people say it's simplistic, because we can all see and judge and act in different ways. You can see, judge and act like Trump. It doesn't mean that you're going to come to good decisions just because you're seeing, judging and acting, because it's still underlying is the subject, the person and the context. And I suppose what you've highlighted is sometimes the disjunct between our theoretical base or doctrinal base and what our activity is when it comes to be applied. But we're not all we're subjects who are actually Christians, with coming from Christian values shaped by tradition, Judeo-Christian values, and we bring those to our seeing, our judging, and our acting. And I suppose that's the part I can understand why people would say this principle won't necessarily, or this see, judging, and acting, it's not as though that will automatically bring good results. And just to add that to the mix.
Thanks.
Well, yes. Well, I would agree with that, and that's why, for example, in the traditional YCW, classical YCW, there always was a gospel inquiry, which was bringing people, in close contact week by week with the person of Jesus, and also, his teachings. So it helped people over time to develop, a basis, and it was the objective was, of course, to concretize it. Well, what am I going to do this week? Not in 3 months' time, not in general, but what am I going to do this week about that girl at work who's being sexually harassed, for example? The thing is, you've got to think of an action this week. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to talk to other workers there, and we're going to do something. Then we're going to come back next week and say what happened. Well, I couldn't talk to that girl. She didn't want to talk about it. I mean, all sorts of things, But that is the thing. It's not a once-off thing. It's a method that's got to be applied over time. It's a method of formation, and we learn by doing. I mean, it's very simple. All these phrases are very, very simple, really. And I mean, people, as I say, also, we already do it. This is all it is. Basically, at the end of the day, is it's formalizing what we do, articulating what we already do, kind of naturally, and helping us hopefully to do it better. But yeah, for this reason, it's very important. The whole kind of gospel thing, but at the same time, I feel we shouldn't be too narrow in that, because we are living in ecumenical interfaith communities now, so we don't want to end up being like proselytizing. Well, the gospel says this, therefore I'm going to do that. I mean, it's also important to learn, well, what do the Muslims think about this, because we have a lot of Muslims living in Australian society now. There's a lot of people immigrating from China, maybe Taoist, or have a Taoist philosophy. So what's the basis on what they act? We've got to kind of work with them, not in a paternalistic way, but in a synodal way, let's say. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Stefan. Rosie, last question, comment. Rosie, you're on mute. That's it.
Yeah. Last Monday, we celebrated the Feast of Mary MacKillop. I think she had a See, Judge, Act, because her mantra to her sisters was never see a need without doing something about it. Now, surely that is see, judge, and act. And I think it's used by lots of people. But, I mean, they articulated see, judge, and act, which is a gospel way of acting.
Yeah, well, as I say, it's a natural method, and people like Mary MacKillop were, whatever their formation background was, they got it. But like I think it's been mentioned by Mary and others, how, we can see over the generations, we see kind of the impact that the YCW method has had on generations of, well, they were young people then, and then they will testify to it themselves, how it's changed their life. And I can testify to myself too, how, and as I say, I go to all these church groups, and they don't, what's the action outcome that comes out of them? Mostly there's not. That's the thing that strikes me every time. I leave these meetings and nobody's asked me to do anything. And and because the meeting's not structured that way, I also haven't asked anybody, what are they going to do? So actually, sometimes I try to do it. I do try to do it. Say, well, what are we going to do this week? Or what do you think you can do about that? I try to do it, but it doesn't fit into the framework of the meeting. And so it's just me saying that as a comment. And so it's sort of through to the keeper. So that's, to me, the value of the See, Judge, Act. We act.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. And thanks for putting your hand up when there was a space this month.
No worries. Yeah.
That was very good. Yeah, great. So we'd all round of applause for Stefan.
Yes.
And don't forget about YTU when you're looking at linking up groups, because we had a strong social justice. That's not even past tense. We have a strong social justice element in what we're doing. Okay, so I'll say bye-bye to everyone.